Good afternoon. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my Library and Foundation colleagues, I welcome you to the 2013 PEN Hemingway and PEN New England Award ceremony. Now, in a moment, I'm going to play a clip from one of this year's Academy Award-winning films. And I'd like to begin with a mini Academy Night acceptance speech. Fortunately, I've already managed to make my way onto stage without tripping on those stairs. And I promise there'll be no unsolicited revelations about my personal life. But I do need to pause and to thank all of the individuals who played a hand in today's festivities, especially PEN New England and its executive committee, Karen Wolf, Helen Atwan, and Richard Hoffman, and my colleague, Amy McDonald, who also happens to now serve as the chair of PEN New England. We also thank the Hemingway Foundation and Society, who fund the PEN Hemingway Award, represented here today by Steve Paul and others. We also recognize the UCross Foundation, the University of Idaho, and the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums. I will be introducing Patrick Hemingway shortly, but I also want to recognize and thank all the members of the Hemingway family who are here with us today, especially Patrick's wife, Carol, one of the guiding forces behind our work with the Hemingway collection, and Sean Hemingway, who, along with his wife, Colette, is the co-chair of the Hemingway Council and an editor of numerous works about and by his grandfather. Let me also recognize other members of the Hemingway Council who are here this afternoon, including Jill Kirk-Conway, Rose Styron, and NPR Weekend Edition host Scott Simon. Working at this library, one cannot help but notice the ubiquitous references to John Kennedy and Ernest Hemingway in popular culture. Watching the Super Bowl, for example, I was confounded to see, flashing across my television screen, Kennedy home movies from this library's AV collection of a young JFK playing touch football with his siblings. Turns out an enterprising marketing firm discovered that these iconic images are in the public domain and cleverly attempted to expropriate them, without asking permission, I might add, to promote the NFL and football as the nation's favorite pastime. And references to Hemingway are similarly omnipresent, such as this scene in Silver Linings Playbook, in which the lead character, played by Bradley Cooper, having been released from a psychiatric unit to live with his parents, attempts to win back his estranged wife by reading the novels she teaches in her high school English class. Here he is, having just finished A Farewell to Arms.
What the? The whole time you're rooting for this Hemingway guy to survive the war and to be with the woman that he loves, Catherine Barkley.
It's 4 o'clock in the morning, Pat.
And he does. He does. He survives the war. After getting blown up, he survives it, and he escapes to Switzerland with Catherine. You think he ends it there? No! She dies, Dad! I mean, the world's hard enough as it is, guys. Can't somebody say, hey, let's be positive? Let's have a good ending to the story?
Pat, you owe us an apology.
Mom, I can't apologize. I'm not going to apologize for this. You know what I will do? I will apologize on behalf of Ernest Hemingway, because that's who's to blame here.
Yeah, have Ernest Hemingway call us and apologize to us, too.
While it does not seem fair to blame all the ills of the world on Ernest Hemingway, we can credit him for many positive things, including our gathering here this afternoon to celebrate great writing. And I should note that a few years ago, Matthew Quick, the author of the novel Silver Linings Playbook, upon which the film is based, participated in this very ceremony as one of our 2009 PEN Hemingway honorees. He reports that the certificate he received then still hangs over the computer he uses to write each day. The PEN Hemingway Award honors an American writer for a first work of fiction. It's fitting to name such an award after Ernest Hemingway based on the example he set as a young man in his 20s, recently married, moving to Paris, writing his first stories and novels, which revolutionized literature in his time. Not only have those works endured, but they've inspired countless readers to become writers themselves, including, most notably today, our keynote speaker. There is something arresting about seeing the breakthrough of any new artist. In an essay on Hart Crane, the American modernist poet, who happened to be born on exactly the same day and year as Ernest Hemingway, Colm Toibin writes, "There are certain single volumes of American poetry, some of them first books or early books, that carry with them a special and spiritual power. They seem to arise from a mysterious impulse and to have been written from an enormous private or artistic need. The poems are full of a primal sense of voice, and the aura of the voice and the rhythms of the poems suggest a relentless desire not to make easy peace with the reader. If some of these poems have the tone of prayers, they are not prayers of comfort or of supplication, as much as urgent laments or cries from the depths where the language has been held much against its will, or has broken free, and now demands to be heard." Hemingway and Crane, having come of age in the first years of the 20th century, were both voices informed by an artistic need and restless desire to be heard and to break language free. How fortunate we are today to celebrate writers in our own time who are doing just the same. I want to thank you all so much for coming to this special ceremony this afternoon. Now, no one connects us better to Ernest Hemingway than his son, Patrick. Who else could write the following? "I remember when I was 10 years old in 1938 and in the 5th grade being beside my father at the top of the stairs on the 2nd floor of our home in Key West when he opened and read a telegram informing him of the start of the last big offensive of the Spanish Republic, which would end 16 weeks later in disaster on the Ebro. Papa left for Spain at once. That was the year my mother, my brother, and I went to war. 3 whole years before Pearl Harbor. My family was, as they say, prematurely anti-fascist." The anecdote is from Patrick's foreword to Hemingway on War, an anthology edited by his nephew Sean, and apropos in light of the novel and novelist we honor today. The foreword continues with the story of how Martha Gellhorn, who was a protege of Eleanor Roosevelt, arranged for Hemingway to be invited to the White House when it was clear that Spain was about to fall to Franco, a meeting that only confirmed Hemingway's dislike of FDR. "Things had gotten off to a bad start from my father's point of view," Patrick writes, "when President Roosevelt somewhat gratuitously remarked that he had not read any work of fiction since his undergraduate days at Harvard. The rest of the evening, the president spent telling about, not listening to, what was going on in Spain. Furthermore," said my father, "Mrs. Roosevelt, although undoubtedly a person with deep sympathies for humanity in general, was a very poor housekeeper. And he had never eaten a worse meal than what he had served at the White House, especially the squab, which was tougher than rubber." It's always such a great pleasure and honor to have Patrick here with us each year. We tend to describe him in our promotional materials as Hemingway's sole surviving son. When hearing that description, he often responds with a twinkle in his eye, "That means I get to have the last word." In this ceremony, we are honored to give him the first. Ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Hemingway.
That is a tough act to follow. And the book we've started this custom of reading something from my father's work, and this year the prize winner has written a beautiful story about war. And war is a very serious subject, so I'm going to read something more comical, more light, so that you can really get down to the seriousness of the yellow birds. Okay. The book I'm going to read an excerpt from is The Torrents of Spring, and in this early edition from Scribner's, on the blurb it says, "First published in 1926, The Torrents of Spring is an amusing parody of the Chicago School of Literature to which Sherwood Anderson subscribed. Poking fun at that great race of writers, it depicts a vogue that Hemingway himself refused to follow. According to the New York Times, The Torrents of Spring reveals Mr. Hemingway's gift for high-spirited nonsense. It contributes to that thoughtful gaiety which true wit should inspire. The book sets out to amuse, this it does." Now, I'm not sure that it will, because It's from a long time ago, almost 100 years, and it is making a lot of references, contemporary things. It sort of resembles those things in Shakespeare's plays that the low-class characters talk about, and you have to read the notes to know how funny it is, right? But anyway, we'll have a try. This is chapter 15 of The Torrents of Spring. They were alone in the beanery now, Scripps and Mandy and Diana. Only the drummer was with them. He was an old friend now, but his nerves were on edge tonight. He folded his paper abruptly and started for the door. "See you all later," he said. He went out into the night. It seemed the only thing to do. He did it. Only 3 of them in the beanery now, Scripps and Mandy and Diana. Only those 3. Mandy was talking, leaning on the counter and talking. Scripps, with his eyes fixed on Mandy, Diana made no pretense of listening now. She knew it was over. It was all over now, but she would make one more attempt, one more last gallant try. Perhaps she still could hold him. Perhaps it had all been just a dream. She steadied her voice, and then she spoke. "Scripps, dear," she said. Her voice shook a little. She steadied it. "What's on your mind?" Scripps asked abruptly. Ah, there it was, that horrid clipped speech again. "Scripps, dear, wouldn't you like to come home?" Diana's voice quavered. "There's a new Mercury." She had changed from the London Mercury to the American Mercury just to please Scripps. "It just came. I wish you felt like coming home. Scripps, that's a splendid thing in this Mercury. Do come home, Scripps. I've never asked anything of you before. Come home, Scripps. Oh, won't you come home?" Scripps looked up. Diana's heart beat faster. Perhaps he was coming. Perhaps she was holding him, holding him, holding him. "Do come, Scripps, dear," Diana said softly. "There's a wonderful editorial in it by Mencken about chiropractors." Scripps looked away. "Why won't you come, Scripps?" Diana pleaded. "No," Scripps said. "I don't give a damn about Mencken anymore." Diana dropped her head. "Oh, Scripps," she said. "Oh, Scripps." This was the end. She had her answer now. She had lost him. Lost him, lost him. It was over. Finished. Done for. She sat crying silently. Mandy was talking again. Suddenly, Diana straightened up. She had one last request to make. One thing she would ask him. Only one. He might refuse her. He might not grant it. But she would ask him. "Scripps," she said. "Scripps," she said. "What's the trouble?" Scripps turned in irritation. Perhaps, after all, he was sorry for her. He wondered. "Can I take the bird, Scripps?" Diana's voice broke. "Sure," said Scripps. "Why not?" Diana picked up the bird cage. The bird was asleep, perched on one leg as on that night when they had first met. What was it he was like? Ah, yes, like an old osprey, an old, old osprey from her own lake country. She held the cage to her tightly. "Thank you, Scripps," she said. "Thank you for this bird." Her voice broke. "And now I must be going." Quietly, silently, gathering her shawl around her, clutching the cage with the sleeping bird and the copy of the Mercury to her breast, and with only a backward glance, a last glance at him who had been her Scripps, she opened the door of the beanery and went out into the night. Scripps did not even see her go. He was intent on what Mandy was saying. Mandy was talking again. "That bird she just took out," Mandy was saying. "Oh, did she take a bird out?" Scripps asked. "Go on with the story. You used to wonder about what sort of bird that was," Mandy went on. "That's right," Scripps agreed. "Well, that reminds me of a story about Goss and the Marquis of Buch," Mandy went on. "Tell it, Mandy, tell it," Scripps urged. "It seemed a great friend of mine, Ford, you've heard me speak of him before, was in the Marquis's castle during the war. His regiment was billeted there, And the Marquis, one of the richest, if not the richest man in England, was serving in Ford's regiment as a private. Ford was sitting in the library one evening. The library was a most extraordinary place. The walls were made of bricks of gold set into tiles or something. I forget exactly how it was. Go on, Scripps urged. It doesn't matter. Anyhow, in the middle of the wall of the library was a stuffed flamingo in a glass case. They understand interior decorating, these English, Scripps said. Your wife was English, wasn't she? Said Manley. From the Lake Country, Scripps answered. Go on with the story. Well, anyway, Mandy went on. Ford was sitting there in the library one evening after mess when the butler came in and said, the Marquis of Buch's compliments, and might he show the library to a group of friends with whom he has been dining. They used to let him dine out, and sometimes they let him sleep in the castle. Ford said, quite. And in came the Marquis in his private's uniform, followed by Sir Edmund Gosse and Professor what's-his-name, I forget it for the moment, from Oxford. Gosse stopped in front of the stuffed flamingo in the glass case and said, what have we here, Buch? It's a flamingo, Sir Edmund, the Marquis answered. That's not my idea of a flamingo, Gosse remarked. No, Gosse, that's God's idea of a flamingo, Professor what's-his-name said. I wish I could remember his name. Don't bother, Scripps said. His eyes were bright. He leaned forward. Something was pounding inside of him, something he could not control. I love you, Mandy, he said. I love you. You are my woman. The thing was pounding away inside of him. It would not stop. That's all right, Mandy answered. I've known you were my man for a long time. Would you like to hear another story? Speaking of woman? Go on, Scripps said. You must never stop, Mandy. You are my woman now. And this may remind some people of, what is it, Downton Abbey? And the other thing it might remind you of is what was billed as Downton Abbey for grown-ups. What's it called? Parade's End. Thank you.
I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. I'm Craig Nova, and I was one of the judges for the PEN Hemingway Award. And first, I would like to thank Patrick for the reading and to say what a pleasure it was, and for him to please accept our appreciation. Next, I would like to thank the other judges for the PEN Hemingway Award. These, of course, were Amy Bloom and Oscar Hijuelos. It is scarcely possible to describe the dedication and seriousness with which they approached this task, which, while demanding, was exquisitely satisfying, just as it was a great honor. Frankly, it was inspiring to see so many young writers doing such lovely work. So, it is my great pleasure to present the awards. First, I would like to say that there were two honorable mentions. These were Catherine Chung for Forgotten Country and Peter M. Wheelwright for As It Is on Earth. Would both of you please stand so we can applaud you? Now, it is my great pleasure to read the citations of the finalists and for the winner of the PEN Hemingway Prize. The first citation is for Jennifer Dubois and her A Partial History of Lost Causes. One of Jennifer Dubois' characters, Irena Ellison, a young woman afraid that she has a fatal disease, asks through her compelling and beguiling story those questions that are essential to all novels that endure. What do we do with the time we have? What is right? And how do we know the truth of the answers we find? And while these notions are encoded in every beautiful sentence, they are unstated and profoundly moving. It has been years since a book so charming, so entertaining, and so necessary has appeared. Not only is A Partial History of Lost Causes literature, it is also a reason for celebration. Jennifer, come up and let me give you a citation. The next citation is for Videy Ratner's In the Shadow of the Banyan. Videy Ratner was 5 years old when the Khmer Rouge came to power in Cambodia, and 9 before she and her mother escaped. With In the Shadow of the Banyan, she has told a gracefully rendered story of that time, rich with history, mythology, folklore, language, and emotion. Moreover, as a testament about Cambodia in that era of forced labor and starvation, resilience and survival, it is a novel that will surely be read and valued by future generations. Videy. And finally, the last citation is for Kevin Powers, The Yellow Birds. The Yellow Birds is a painful, compact, and distressing novel, as blunt and painful as a broken shoulder, and as lyrical as any memorable epic poem about any of our terrible wars. There is a promise and hope in the story of young Private Bartle and the even younger Private Murphy. 2 young men sharing the wish that they might save each other and be saved, and the reality of all the things they do not know about the wreckage of war, about friendship and its hidden delicacy, about loss and memory and what these things do to young men. Kevin Powers was a machine gunner in Iraq. Now he's a writer with a poet's eye and a soldier's determination, bringing us a first great novel. Kevin.
Thank you very much. I'm incredibly honored to be here with my fellow honorees. It's been a pleasure to meet you. Thank you to the PEN Foundation, of course, to the Kennedy Library. When I was in Mosul, Iraq, this is not a place I ever expected to be. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to read a short passage of the book. Our narrator is home. He's leaving his childhood home for the last time, and he's reflecting on the grief he feels for a friend he's lost, and reflecting on the nature of grief in general. I sat down there a while until the sun was straight above me, and the light fell down in wide columns and sweat ran down between my shoulder blades. I decided then to walk the tracks toward the city. It wasn't so much a decision as it was a product of trying to turn off my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about Murph. I drifted and followed the guidance of the tops of my boots, and I tried not to think, and when I got back up to the porch, I wiped the sweat from my forehead, opened the sliding door, put a few things in my duffel bag, and left. I hadn't known what I was doing then, but my memories of Murph were a kind of misguided archaeology. Sifting through the remains of what I remembered about him was a denial of the fact that a hole was really all that was left, an absence I had attempted to reverse, but found that I could not. There was simply not enough material to account for what had been removed. The closer I got to reconstructing him in my mind, the more the picture I was trying to recreate receded. For every memory I was able to pull up, another seemed to fall away forever. There was some proportion about it all, though. It was like putting a puzzle together from behind, the shapes familiar, the picture quickly fading, the muted tan of the cardboard backing a tease at wholeness and completion. I think of a time when we sat in the evening in the guard tower, watching the war go by in streaks of red and green and other briefer lights, and he'd tell me of an afternoon in the little hillside apple orchard that his mother worked, the turn and flash of a paring knife along a wrap of gauze as they grafted uppers to rootstocks and new branches to blossom, or the time he saw but could not explain his awe when his father brought a dozen caged canaries home from the mine and let them loose in the hollow where they lived. How the canaries only flitted and sang a while before perching back atop their cages, which had been arranged in rows, his father likely thinking that the birds would not return by choice to their captivity, and that cages should be used for something else, a pretty bed for vegetables, perhaps a place to string up candles between the trees. And in what strange silences the world worked, Murph must have wondered, as the birds settled peaceably in their formation and ceased to sing. And I'd try to recall things until nothing came, which I quickly found was my only certainty, until what was left of him was a sketch in shadow, a skeleton falling apart, and my friend Murph was no more friend to me than the strangest stranger. My missing him became a grave that could not be filled or leveled, just a faded blemish in a field, and a damn poor substitute for grief, as graves so often are. Thank you very much.
Hi, welcome. As Tom Putnam mentioned, I'm the new chair of PEN New England, and I'm honored to be introducing our three winners in poetry, nonfiction, and fiction. PEN New England has been honoring New England writers for over 30 years, one of whom I recognize, Jill Kirk Conway, is a past winner. Others have been Jennifer Haig, Andre Dubuse, E.B. White. I'd like to begin the awards, and I hope I have the right glasses, for the poetry for David Huddle. The title poem of David Huddle's new book of poems, Black Snake at the Family Reunion, first signals the generosity of his inclusions, then introduces you to some of the poet's near and extended family, and then allows them and you to go on your way, a little bit improved by the family story he has gotten down on the page. Whether Huddle is writing out of his own experience or his imagination, the poems in this book display a non-coercive ease, a sympathetic eye for the delicate complexity of our relationships, and an abiding gratitude for whatever is. This is a book to read again and again. Thank you, David. Bernd Heinrich is our winner for nonfiction, and this will be a pleasure to read. I don't think I'll ever read anything quite like this again. Bernd Heinrich's Life Everlasting, The Animal Way of Death, offers an intriguing window into the most intimate details of the natural world, specifically dung beetles, vultures, wolves, ravens, and other complex creatures who serve as efficient undertakers, deconstructing the dead and manufacturing the fertilizer that keeps the planet in cycle. Heinrich is both a fearless naturalist and a natural storyteller, and his intriguing book combines meticulous observation with compelling reflection on the need for human beings to profoundly reconsider our burial practices and severed connection with nature. Life Everlasting is thoughtful, challenging, yet thoroughly accessible to the lay reader, and a book that stays alive in the reader's mind long after the final page is turned. Thank you, Bernd. I should mention that our poetry and nonfiction judges, Dinty Moore and Charles Martin, are not here with us, but Patricia Eakins is, who was our fiction judge, which goes to Heidi Julewitz, and Heidi will be reading from her book after I give this citation. The Vanishers by Heidi Julewitz is a narrative high-wire act, astounding stunt after astounding stunt, performed without a net. Like Poe, Julewitz traffics in horror and mystery, but she flips and reflips these genres into the heady realm of the paranormal, arguably to create a new genre. Her spookiness, for all its whiffs of the weird antique, is utterly contemporary, undermined as it is intensified by her ironic playfulness and her astringent sense of humor. Her evocation of the paranormal is both plausible and implausible, oscillating before us like a mirage, a dream, or a parallel universe. Within these coruscations, her portrayal of the mother-daughter relationship is fierce, tender, and uncannily accurate. Her portrait of grief is simply and deeply touching. Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you so much for this award. I moved to New York 20 years ago. I grew up in Maine, and I still spend part of the year there, and I was so nervous that I might be disqualified on a technicality that I went and renewed my driver's license in Maine last week. And so it did get renewed, and so yeah, no disqualification. I also, when I'm in Maine, I live about a quarter mile, maybe even a fifth or sixth of a mile from where E.B. White is buried. And after I learned that I had won this award, and I learned that he had also been a winner, I actually often go to his grave and tell him how awesome he is, because I feel like writers can never hear how awesome they are. Even after they're dead, writers need to hear how awesome they are. And so I went there 2 days ago. I was up in Maine to tell him how proud I was to have won this award, because he had also won it. And also, Jill Kerr Conway, I would have visited your grave as well, but you're not dead yet, and you don't live within walking distance of you're not buried within walking distance of my house, but also a great honor to be sharing this with you. Okay, so I'm going to read quickly from, it's 2 pages exactly, and I read quickly, so we're talking 4 minutes here. Yeah, I guess it's not so strange that I go and talk to dead people, because this is a novel about a woman who is a psychic whose really only psychic failure is that she can't get in touch with her dead mother. So it is also about grief and failure, my favorite topic. And also, just to solidify my New England cred, this town is sort of based on what I wish Hanover, New Hampshire was like, which is where I went to college. The attack, we later agreed, occurred at Madame Ackerman's 43rd birthday party. The evening was typical for late October: icebox air, onyx sky, white mountains lumped darkly in the distance and peripherally visible as a more opaque variety of night. Because I knew that Madame Ackerman's A-frame would be underheated, I wore a wool jumper and wool tights and a pair of silver riding boots purchased from the Nepalese import store run by an aging WASP hippie. Hers was one of 7 businesses in the town of East Warwick, New Hampshire. There was also a vegan pizza parlor, a hardware store, a purveyor of Fair Isle knitwear, a bank, a pub, and a real estate agent. A town that existed in the minds of some to provide basic material support to the faculty and students at the Institute of Integrated Parapsychology, referred to locally and by those in the field as the workshop. That I, Julia Severn, a second-year initiate and Madame Ackerman's stenographer, had been invited to her 43rd birthday party was an anomaly that I failed to probe. When I let slip to my stenographic predecessor, Miranda, that I had been asked to Madame Ackerman's for a social occasion, Miranda tried to hide her wounded incredulity by playing with the pearl choker she habitually wore, and in apprehensive moments such as these, rolled into her mouth, allowing the pearls to yank on the corners of her lips like a horse's bit. Madame Ackerman observed a firm boundary between her academic and personal lives, Miranda said, removing her pearls halfway, wedging them now into the recession above her chin. She was not the kind of professor, Miranda cautioned, straining her necklace's string with her lower jaw until it threatened to snap, to invite an initiate to her house for a social occasion, not even as a volunteer passer of hors d'oeuvres. Miranda's jealousy was understandable. Madame Ackerman's attentions were the prize over which we initiates competed, the reason we'd come to the workshop, to study with her, hopefully, yes, but in more pitiable terms, to partake of her forbidding imperial aura by walking behind her on the many footpaths that vivisectioned the campus quad into slivers of mud or grass or snow. Thus, I reassured Miranda, who, despite the year she'd spent as her stenographer, clearly did not know Madame Ackerman. One of the many admirable qualities Madame Ackerman possessed was that, even as a relentless investigator of past lives, she could permit bygones to be bygones. Yes, she'd selected me from a pool of 35 initiates to be her stenographer, and yes, we'd both immediately come to regret this decision of hers. But after weeks of misunderstandings, deceptions, and hostilities between us, Madame Ackerman was not above extending an olive branch. And so, on the night of October 25th, I donned my silver boots and, awash in optimism and specialness, drove to Madame Ackerman's A-frame. As I passed the custodian-lit workshop buildings, their windows flickering behind the spruces, I allowed myself to view the scene from the future perspective of an older self, wrought by nostalgia for this place I'd yet to leave or miss. In order to prolong my anticipation of what was sure to be a momentous evening, I took the scenic way along the Connecticut River. In the moonlight, the water, whisked to a sharp chop by the wind, appeared seized into a treacherous hoar of ice. I spied a hunter emerging from an old barn whom I mistook for the shadowy half-second before my car beams illuminated him to be wearing the decapitated head of a deer. A bat died against my windshield. And yet, despite these dark portents, I somehow failed to divine, as I turned off the river road and began the slow ascent to Madame Ackerman's A-frame, that I would never drive along this river again. Or that I would drive along this river again, yes, but I would no longer be the sort of person who wore silver boots to parties and believed that bygones could be bygones. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. That was wonderful. And thank you, Kevin, for your reading as well. I'm Helen Atwan. I'm the director of Beacon Press and also the administrator of the Hemingway Foundation PEN Award. I am very sorry to report that Amy Bloom, who did us the great favor of judging the Hemingway Award this year, along with Oscar Ijuelos and Craig Nova, and who had planned to be here to introduce our keynote speaker, has fallen victim to the terrible scourge that has laid so many people low this long and endless winter. So she could not join us today. It's especially hard for Amy because she had been so looking forward to this happy moment. But she has asked me to read her introduction, which I am proud to do, since Colm Toibin is a writer I admire greatly and who I know has been a great supporter of first fiction, including Kevin Powers' book, and, it is reported, spent his days on the beach at 17, if this is true, reading The Essential Hemingway, the copy of which he still professes to have pages stained with cedar. So here are Amy Bloom's words. It is an honor to introduce this man, one of my favorite contemporary writers. Just listing his books is a pleasure because to name them is to remember them, and they have all left deep, lasting marks. His first prize winner, The South, the ones that were shortlisted for the Booker, The Blackwater Lightship, and The Master, Brooklyn, the winner of the Costa Novel of the Year, the exceptional recent essay collection, New Ways to Kill Your Mother, and his most recent compassionate, provocative, The Testament of Mary. And every other novel or collection of essays, whether on Henry James or traveling through Catholic Europe, or any one of his short stories. Toibin wrote about another equally good writer, Jane Austen, that her Mansfield Park is not a moral fable or an exploration of the individual's role in society. It is not our job to like or dislike characters in fiction or to learn from them how to live. A novel is a pattern, and it is our job to relish and see clearly its textures and tones, to note how its textures were woven and its tones put in place. I would say the same thing about Colm Toibin's work, that its textures and tones are powerful and dynamic, but so is the storytelling. As a New York Times reviewer described one of his superb short stories, it unfolds to reveal a complex portrait with the emotional density and historical depth of field of a novel, as does all his work. There is, as Grace Paley put it about something else, no stinginess. There is pleasure and trouble. There is a full life of the senses. There is a grief that knocks people down where they stand, and there is love which happily, for me as a reader, opens, closes, overturns, and changes much without necessarily redeeming a damn thing. And there is the storytelling from the inside out, full of empathy and sharp observations, conversations overheard and created, people understood, if not necessarily admired, and disparate worlds brought close to us, spinning on his dexterous fingers as the magician, Colm Toibin, helps us see and hear the textures and tones. The reviews for Toibin's work are, as they should be, full of praise for his subtlety, his empathy, his wide-ranging imagination, his graceful, evocative prose with sentences that are both achingly lovely and powerful, for his unforgettable characters, and, I would add, what he does with them. Of Colm Toibin's work, one can say, as the Irish Times said in its Irish Timesy way, his work does not disappoint. It does not. it illuminates, and it lasts. Colm Toibin.
It's a very special honor to be here today at the John F. Kennedy Library when my father took me out of school in June 1963, which is almost 50 years ago. He took me out of school so I could witness history. It was when John Fitzgerald Kennedy came back to Wexford as President of the United States. His great-grandfather had left County Wexford, and we were from Wexford. And we stood on the quays in Wexford town, and we watched him, and it was an amazing moment. It was a hugely inspiring moment for all of us. It mattered enormously, and I think it changed our country in many ways. It let us know that anything was possible. It wasn't merely inspiring in very large and grand ways, although it was. The ways it inspired us were large and were grand, but also in small ways. Before he died, a few months before he died, I spoke to Arthur Schlesinger in New York. He told me that in the crafting of the speech which President Kennedy gave to the joint houses of the Oireachtas, the joint houses of Parliament in Ireland, they had very carefully inserted something that was a sort of dynamite, a sort of wake-up call for Ireland, that among the banished children of Ireland was James Joyce. His name was almost unmentionable. His books were unread. He was not publicly recognised in any way. His manuscripts were not in any holdings in Ireland. There was no statue of him, no street called after him. And his name was anathema in Ireland. And in that speech, John Kennedy used his name as a great son of Ireland, as someone Ireland should be proud of. And he said it in our Parliament building. And I think that was a very important moment in the lifting of censorship and in the opening up of things in Ireland. Just further to add that in many other ways, the Kennedy family have been so important for our country in the work that Senator Edward Kennedy did, often behind the scenes, to create peace in Northern Ireland. And it's wonderful that the son of Jean Kennedy Smith, and the ambassador, your ambassador to our country, who, as ambassador during those crucial years when peace was being forged and when things were very difficult and very delicate in Ireland, she held in a key position and worked tirelessly for a simple thing in Northern Ireland and indeed on the island called peace. And both her and Senator Kennedy, and perhaps it will only be known in the future when the archives are fully opened, the amount of work they did for that and their dedication for that. And it's something that I think will be acknowledged even more in the future than it is now. But even now, it's something that we are grateful for. As was mentioned, in 1972, when I was 17, my mother really wanted to get me out of the house. I was sort of sitting around a lot and seemed to be dreaming dreams that didn't seem healthy. So they found me a job quite a distance away, just so they wouldn't have to see me for the rest of the summer, as a barman, a 17-year-old barman. I was a wimp in the Grand Hotel in Tramore, which is a seaside resort in County Waterford in the southeast of Ireland. I suppose that some part of the hotel may have really been grand, or compared, say, with other hotels in the region, which were certainly not grand, or it might have been grand in the past, but it did not seem grand to me in 1972. The bar was small and dingy, and it was not very busy in the day. But it was at night that the grandeur emerged, if grandeur is the word. And grandeur indeed may be the word, because at around 11 or so, in the ballroom of the hotel, the vast ballroom added to the back of the hotel, the grandeur emerged in the guise of a grand appetite for alcohol. No one could have enough of the stuff, and they wanted even more in the 2 hours when all the other bars in Tramore were shut, and the bar and the ballroom of the Grand Hotel had a special license to go on serving on a grand scale. Drinkers in those 2 hours were 5 deep at the bar, calling for more. They were frantic to have their orders heard over the loud music. Orders came like 2 vodkas and tonic, 1 vodka and white lemonade, 2 pints of Guinness, and a double Jameson. pulling a pint of Guinness. I was a dreamer. I was interested in literature. Pulling a pint of Guinness then as now took skill and it took time. You pulled half of it and then left it to settle, but by the time you'd found it again, you'd forgotten the rest of the order, and you could not locate the customer among the crowd. And the strange part was, when you went to clean up at the end of the night, much of the last orders demanded with such urgency and carried away in triumph by a man, had not even been touched. It was hard work, and as you can imagine, I did not last long. Mostly, extras like me were needed at night or at the weekend, but slowly, I wasn't needed at all. But while I was there, it meant you were free during the day. And one day, when the weather was fine, I went on my own to the Long Beach in Tramore. The word Tramore comes from the Gaelic tra, meaning beach, and more, meaning big. And I brought a book. And I have no idea why I had this book rather than any other book. I had taken it from home. It was a Penguin paperback, and it was called The Essential Hemingway, and yes, I still have it. And it had that photograph of that bearded man who looked wise and skeptical and handsome in a weathered sort of way on the jacket. It included short stories and extracts from some novels, but it also included the entire text of The Sun Also Rises. And this was what I read on that beach, on that afternoon, and the afternoon that followed. Literature, as Rapin said, is news that stays news. But I wonder if literature is also something that hits the nervous system before it can be filtered by the intelligence. It moves like energy. I had nothing in common with any of the people in that novel. I had never been in Paris or in Spain. I had never seen a bullfight, or I'd never been fishing. I'd never been outside Ireland. I did not know any Americans, nor any English people. I'd never been drunk. I knew nothing or nothing that I wish to repeat here with a mixed audience about sex. And yet the book overwhelmed me. It opened a world for me. Before anything else, the world it opened was the world of the book itself, its characters, what they did and said. That world seemed more real and true, and indeed more fascinating than the one I inhabited. I felt for Jake, and indeed I became him. I too wanted Lady Brett Ashley. I could not have her. I too wanted the bulls to be good. I too wanted my friends to behave. I too knew the manager of the hotel, although I should say the manager of the hotel was looking at me by this time in a very glowering sort of way in Tramore. I too was stoical, and I too liked being alone. And I too knew that things would never be the same again. As soon as I could, and it took me 3 years to organize this, I went to Spain, and I stayed there for 3 years. It was hard to explain at home why I wanted to go there in the first place. Even later, I found it easier to say that I went to Spain in search of drugs and sex and rock and roll, since my friends knew that I didn't like drugs and I had no interest whatsoever in rock and roll. It would have been harder to explain that I went to Spain because of a book I had read on a beach in Tramore when I was 17, a book I have never tired of. Later, I came to analyze the style, the great Hemingway invention. I saw how the emotion lived between the lines, within the cadences and the rhythms of the sentences. Hemingway, as a writer, felt the emotion and then saw no reason to parade what he felt, or wear it on his sleeve, or cheaply name it, thus to reduce the grandeur of its ambiguous and mysterious power. Instead, he found a way of enticing it from the depths, as a fisherman might, or luring it towards him as a matador might, and then allowing it to evade easy capture, giving it strength and subtlety, allowing it to dart in the light, flex its muscles, create excitement. Sometimes he wrote like a painter, each brushstroke filled with a mixture of things. He was ready to suggest, ready to leave some of the emotion out, so that oddly it would be all the more present because of his tact and the delicacy of his touch. Sometimes he wrote like Cézanne painted, and this idea fascinated me and gave me as much as I got from reading The Sun Also Rises for the first time. There's a deleted passage in Hemingway's story, Big Two-Hearted River, where Hemingway wrote of an alter ego, he wanted to write like Cézanne painted. Cézanne started with all the tricks, then he broke the whole thing down and built the real thing. It was hell to do. He wanted to write about country so that it would be there like Cézanne had done it in painting. He felt almost holy about it. In his memoir of his early years in Paris, A Movable Feast, Hemingway also wrote about the power the French painter had over him as he learned his trade. I was learning something from the painting of Cézanne that made writing simple, that made writing simple, true sentences far from enough to make the stories have the dimensions I was trying to put into them. I was not articulate enough to explain it to anybody. Besides, it was a secret. The secret lay in the brush strokes of Cézanne, each one open and obvious in its textures, with repetitions and subtle variations, each one containing something close to emotion, but emotion deeply controlled. Each stroke sought to pull the eye in and hold it, and yet also build to a larger design in which there was a richness and density, but also much that was mysterious and hidden. This is what Hemingway sought to do with his sentences. By looking at the work of Cézanne first in Chicago, as he did, then in the museums of Paris, and then in the home of his friend Gertrude Stein, he sought to follow Stein's example and make the sentences and the paragraphs he wrote ostensibly simple, filled with repetitions and odd variations, charged with a sort of hidden electricity, filled with an emotion which the reader could not easily find in the words themselves, emotion which seemed to live in the space between the words or in the sudden endings of certain paragraphs. Thus, in A Movable Feast, Hemingway could write, quote, "But Paris was a very old city and we were young and nothing was simple there, not even poverty, nor sudden money, nor the moonlight, nor right and wrong, nor the breathing of someone who lay beside you in the moonlight." In that sentence, he managed to declare very little, but to suggest a great deal. In the 41 words, 27 words have only one syllable. This makes the reader feel comfortable, as though something easy were being said. But it is clear from the way the punctuation works and the variation within the phrasing that nothing is in fact simple and much is ambiguous and almost painful. Instead of saying so, Hemingway manages to give the impression of this, to comfort the reader with the diction, but then jolt the reader with the shifting levels of tone and meaning within the clauses. The theory of this is to let the writer do the feeling and to register this in the prose, bury it in the white spaces. Thus the reader will come to feel it all the more intensely, because it will not come as mere information, but as something much more powerful. It will come as rhythm, and it will come so subtly that the reader's imagination will be deeply engaged in capturing it in all its uncertainty and strangeness. Thus it will be closer to music in its impact, but the words will still hold their meaning. It will play the stability of meaning against the mystery of silent sound. This idea that what you leave out in prose writing is more important than what you put in made its way into the very core of Hemingway's method as a novelist and short story writer. At its best, it could work miracles. A few years ago, when I was working, actually I was once more dawdling or making myself useless. This time I was in the library of the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. And it was that same free song as I had earlier today, at looking at Hemingway's handwriting, looking at those wonderful sentences from that novel that I love so much. Some of the sentences that were deleted, that seemed to me perfect in their way. I would not have taken them out. And it may be interesting to see this new edition, but sentences that remained in and that are so important. The free song of just looking at that, looking at the handwriting, realizing there was a time when these weren't written, when this sentence was not there, and then it came into being in a wonderful, miraculous way. But I found a film script of The Sun Also Rises. It was written by a professional scriptwriter, and which Hemingway hated. He seemed to hate the script, and then he grew to hate the scriptwriter. And he made this pretty clear as he read the script. it was obviously a good day because he wrote abuse in the margins, and it was so exciting seeing his handwriting and feeling his rage. He became especially enraged when the screenwriter tried to suggest that Jake, the protagonist of the novel, was impotent for psychological reasons. Hemingway emphatically declared, and it's written in the margins, that Jake had his testicles shot off in the war, something Hemingway had seen happen a number of times, he wrote. But he did not make this clear or fully clear in the text of the novel itself, however. Although it is implied, we're also allowed to believe that there is something in Jake's psychosexual makeup which renders him impotent. It may have happened in the war, it is suggested, but it could have been psychological. In any case, as Lady Brett Ashley felt, and as I felt, and as Jake himself felt, it was hard luck on a guy, tough luck. There was nothing more to be said. The novel takes place in the present. We're given tantalizing hints and clues about events in the past, about who Jake is and where he comes from. But most of the past is left out, thus offering a depth to the actions of the present. Jake is not described physically, and this also means that the act of reading the book is an intense act of imagining, filling in the gaps, which is mirrored in the prose itself. The writing is ostensibly simple, with short declarative sentences. In this work, Hemingway tried to achieve what Cézanne had achieved in his paintings, something dense, which pulls the eye and the imagination in towards itself, using a technique which seems open and simple, but the result finally can contain not only an impression, but an infinite amount of emotion. Hemingway stands for me, with the poet Wallace Stevens, as the greatest American writer of his age. Although Stevens took a dim view of the novel form itself, he remained alert to what Hemingway was doing in prose, and this might have been greatly helped by a fist fight between the two men in Key West in 1936, in which Stevens, ever the dandy, poor Stevens, he broke his fist while attempting to break Hemingway's jaw. In a letter written in 1942, Wallace Stevens saw Hemingway as a poet, and the most significant of living poets, he said, so far as what he called extraordinary actuality is concerned. In 1945, he wrote, "Someone told me the other day that Ernest Hemingway was writing poetry. I think it is likely that he will write a kind of poetry in which the consciousness of reality will produce an extraordinary effect. I have no doubt that supreme poetry can be produced only on the highest possible level of the cognitive." I did not know those nights in 1972 as I pulled bad pints of Guinness in Tramore and forgot everyone's order, that what I was really doing, was looking forward to going back to the beach and the book, that I was being pulled towards the highest possible level of the cognitive. I'm sure I would not have even known the highest possible level of the cognitive, even had it come up from the sea and bit me, or been served for tea. And I'm still not sure, which must in its own way be a good thing. All I know is that we must strive towards it in all the sentences we write, and all our paragraph endings and all our lines of dialogue. It is our job to make the cognitive more precise than it has ever been, more rich in color and more mysterious. And on an occasion like this, with Hemingway watching over us, and the ghost of Wallace Stevens, and indeed John Kennedy, we can also follow the man and his companion in that poem by Wallace Stevens with a wonderful title, How to Live, What to Do, which ends with these words, that the men were joyous and jubilant and sure. Thank you.
I can't think of any other words than to say that was thoroughly grand. I invite you all in a few moments to join in a reception in the library's magnificent pavilion after one final comment. I'm genuinely moved by the almost sacred ritual of this annual ceremony, and your notion of Hemingway, the words are almost holy. As we celebrate new writers on the cusp of spring, renewing our spirits as perhaps only art can do. So let's allow the benediction to be offered by President Kennedy, and a speech celebrating the role of the artist delivered 50 years ago this October while dedicating the Robert Frost Library at Amherst College. His first sentence, slightly clipped in the original recording, begins, "Our national strength matters."
Our strength matters, but the spirit which informs and controls our strength matters just as much. This was the special significance of Robert Frost. He brought an unsparing instinct for reality to bear on the platitudes and pieties of society. His sense of the human tragedy fortified him against self-deception and easy consolation. "I have been," he wrote, "one acquainted with the night." And because he knew the midnight as well as the high noon, because he understood the ordeal as well as the triumph of the human spirit, he gave his age strength with which to overcome despair.
I thank you. I thank you all for coming this afternoon to celebrate the writers among us who give our own age strength with which to overcome despair. Happy spring. Thank you for coming.
Great sermon. It's a beautiful sermon. Yeah. No, but it's a lovely sermon. It is. Yes.